Continuing now with The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. When we left off at the end of our last session, we were in the middle of Wednesday, August 7th. So that's where we'll take up in this session. Wednesday, August 7th, 1974. Haig had word that David Eisenhower and Ed Cox wanted to see him. He called Buchanan and asked him to go talk to the president's sons-in-law. Although there were signs that the family was relenting, Haig said, they were still the last stumbling block to resignation. Bruce Hershenson, Haig said, was talking to Julie, reinforcing her opinion that her father should never resign. Hershenson wanted the president to go down in history as a fighter, and he was telling her that winning or losing in the Senate was not the important thing, that standing up for the office would assure the president his proper role in history. Buchanan said he would be glad to take on the task. David and Ed arrived in Buchanan's office shortly afterward. "We've come to see you about the president," Cox said. They were trying to get both sides, and they wanted to hear the arguments in favor of resignation again. For an hour, Buchanan calmly plowed back through the ground-covered Saturday, insisting still that resignation was the only solution. David was impressed that Buchanan, the ultimate Nixon man, had overcome his conditioning. He had the character to arrive at his own conclusion and hold to it in the face of the president's resistance. This gave David confidence that he too would be able to hold his ground against his wife and his father-in-law. Cox did most of the talking and questioning. He weighed both sides carefully as if he were going to make a presentation and wanted to be able to state each side of the case fully and fairly. David and Ed thanked Buchanan. Then they picked up Tricia and walked over to the president's EOB office. Because the discussion was to be a lawyerly review, Tricia did not go inside. The president was sitting alone. David was glad they were in the EOB office. He felt that this room, unlike the Oval Office with its ceremonial trappings, invited conversation on a human scale. David divided conversations with his father-in-law into two categories. Either Nixon dominated and did most of the talking, or he was withdrawn and allowed conversations to simply go on around him. This time it was different. They had information to exchange. Ed explained that he and David had been canvassing people to get recommendations. There were arguments for and against staying. If he stayed and didn't resign, Cox said, the administration still had vast resources to make a defense in a Senate trial. It would be heroic, and a vigorous defense might narrow the charges. Whatever the result, the full airing would lend perspective to Watergate and show that it was a small matter. Borrowing from Buchanan, David and Ed then outlined the arguments for resignation. A Senate trial could take months, disrupt the government, hurt the economy, and complicate foreign relations. The country needed a leader, David said. The president shot a glance at him. David thought he might have gone too far, but the president seemed for once willing to discuss Watergate matter-of-factly. "Unless something happens," Nixon said. "My friends in the Senate are saying I should resign." He looked away from David and Ed. Those friends included Senators Stennis, Long, Bennett, and James B. Allen of Alabama, Nixon said. "I haven't decided anything for sure," he said abruptly, but David sensed that he had. The president was calm about the subject, one of the few times David had seen him so. He was dealing rationally with arguments on both sides. His visitors nodded understandingly. They were not pushing. "Do you think they're going to give us a hard time on our papers and tapes?" Nixon asked. That, too, seemed to indicate he was planning to leave office, David thought. They both said he should certainly be entitled to keep his papers, tapes, and files as other presidents had. Nixon took another step. He wondered about transporting his files to California. If he resigned, that was where he would go. He wanted to own the papers so that he could work on his book. He would write his memoirs. If he didn't get his papers, people would be rummaging through them for years. The president posed other questions about his future. It was a future out of office in California. "I want to take some time off to travel." That would be a good idea. "What about the climate of retribution?" he asked. He answered his own question slowly. If he resigned, people would become apathetic about him. And of course, resignation would silence him politically for a long time. David knew that the great unspoken item of business was a pardon for his father-in-law, but the president didn't broach it. Nixon seemed to lose interest in the conversation. Normally, he would have dismissed his visitors at that point, but Nixon seemed to cling to them, letting the talk wander back and forth. Clearly, he didn't want them to leave, so they stayed. David thought it was as if Mr. Nixon didn't have anything to do. Finally, the president picked up the phone and called Steve Bull. "When the fellows come in, put them in the office, and I'll be over in a few minutes." David and Ed left. Bull didn't make it to the Oval Office with the president's visitors, Scott, Goldwater, and Rhodes. As they came in at the West Wing basement, Timmons had them intercepted and brought to his office. Haig, Birch, and Timmons once again reviewed the necessity of keeping the meeting cool. "He's been up and down," Haig said. "It's been about 90% set with him now. Please don't raise the question of resignation. He knows what you're going to tell him about the situation. He needs to hear it from you." "He'll get the truth," Goldwater said. "That's what he wants?" Goldwater was disbelieving. Nixon rarely wanted that. "Yes," Haig said. Haig meant to turn the meeting into a ritual in which the senators could imagine they were asserting their authority, and the president could preserve the illusion that he was acting independently. The three leaders left Timmons' office and walked down the hall and into the Oval Office. It was about 5 p.m. The president entered seconds later. He shook hands with all three. "How's that boy of yours?" he asked Rhodes. "He's fine," the minority leader answered, astounded. But Nixon always remembered personal details. "He's working in the trust department of the Valley National Bank," Rhodes said. "That's great," the president said. "That's a great bank." The president turned and sat down behind the large desk. Rhodes took the chair to the president's left, Scott the one to his right. Goldwater was directly in front. Scott realized it was probably the first time he had talked to the president without one of the White House aides in attendance. He had had private conversations with Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, but never with Nixon. The president seemed at ease, almost serene, as he leaned back in his swivel chair and began chatting. Goldwater thought he looked as though he had just shot a hole in one. Disappointment was audible in his voice, however. The president referred briefly to men he had campaigned for who had turned against him. He knew their names. Rhodes was thinking that there was no sense of wrongdoing in the president's attitude. Nixon was talking politics and votes as if it were another bill on which he wanted a head count. Then abruptly, Nixon cut the small talk. "Well, we're all aware of why you are here. We might as well get down to it." He turned to Rhodes. "I guess I've got maybe 10 votes on the floor of the House?" he asked with a faint hint of sarcasm. Before Rhodes could answer, he was going to say that the president had more, maybe 50 or 60. Nixon turned to the others. "Who wants to open up?" "We've asked Barry to be our spokesman," Scott replied. "Go ahead, Barry," the president said, staring straight ahead at Goldwater. "Mr. President, this isn't pleasant, but you want to know the situation, and it isn't good." Goldwater was certain the president had heard his estimate on the phone to Haig the day before, but lots of numbers had been flying around for several days. 12, 15, less than 20. Goldwater was thinking, what had he told Haig? "Pretty bad, huh?" "Yes, sir," Goldwater answered, still trying to recall the exact number he had quoted. "How many would you say would be with me?" "Half a dozen," the president said. Was there sarcasm in his voice? "More than that," Goldwater said, "maybe 16 to 18. "Hugh," the president said, turning to his right, "do you agree with that?" "I'd say maybe 15, Scott said, but it's grim," he added, "and they're not very firm." "Damn grim," the president shot back. Goldwater said, "We've discussed the thing a lot, and just about all of the guys have spoken up, and there aren't many who would support you if it comes to that." Goldwater decided to ram it home. "I took kind of a nose count today, and I couldn't find more than 4 very firm votes, and those would be from older Southerners. Some are very worried about what's been going on and are undecided, and I'm one of them." That final kick had delivered, Goldwater hoped. The president turned to Rhodes. "John, I know how you feel, what you've said. I respect it, but what's your estimate?" Rhodes was thinking there would still be some support for the president in the House, but he wanted the message to be stern. "About the same, Mr. President," he said. Well, that's about the way I thought it was. I've got a very difficult decision to make, but I want you to know I'm going to make it for the best interests of the country. There were nods around three sides of the desk. I'm not interested in pensions, the president continued. I'm not interested in pardons or amnesty. I'm going to make this decision for the best interests of the country. Goldwater could feel tears in his eyes. He could see that the others were emotional too. Mr. President, Scott said, we are all very saddened, but we have to tell you the facts. Never mind, the president replied, almost jerking out the words, watching the eyes of his visitors. There will be no tears. I haven't cried since Eisenhower died. My family has been fine. I'm going to be all right. He talked about how much he had loved President Eisenhower. It had been a long time in politics, the president said. Goldwater and he had been campaigning for about 20 years. He started to muse again about things he had done for some of the people who now wanted him out of office, then stopped himself short. But this is water over the dam, he said. It's beside the point. He leaned toward Rhodes. Do I have any other options? Mr. President, Rhodes answered, when I leave this room, I want to tell the people who are waiting outside that we never discussed any options. Oh, I do too, the president said hastily. I didn't mean that, he paused. I'm going to make the decision, he said flatly. All the points in the script had been covered. The president stood up from behind his desk. Well, thank you very much, he said. Thank you, Rhodes replied. You're a great friend. The president didn't reply. He shook their hands, but he seemed locked in thought as they walked out. Haig and Birch were waiting for the three leaders in Timmons' office. Goldwater summarized the session. Haig wanted to be certain. Did the president make any statement beyond what you've said? He asked intently. No. 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 There had been no slip-ups, no demands, no deals for resignation. Goldwater said that they were going to meet with reporters but would not get into any details. Haig assented. As they walked out of Timmons' office, Goldwater asked Rhodes, is there any doubt in your mind what he's going to do? No. Any doubt in yours? No. It's sort of amazing. Here's the first time that this has ever happened. And who was sitting there with the president? Two guys from one of the smallest states. The meeting had not taken long. It was 5:42 when they walked to the cameras. Whatever decision he makes, it will be in the best interest of our country, Goldwater said. There has been no decision made. The reporters pressed. Goldwater lied. I have no way of knowing, and we have no way of making nose counts, he said. I myself have not made up my mind, and I think I can speak for most of the senators that they haven't made up their minds. Scott backed him up. We have not discussed or taken any counts ourselves as far as I know. While the congressional leaders were with the president, Haig had called Bazart, St. Clair, and Garman into his office. He wanted them all there as witnesses in case any improper suggestions were made. Then he phoned Haldeman. St. Clair listened to the conversation on an extension. Bob, the matter has been seriously considered, Haig said. It just can't be done. We've talked about it here thoroughly. Haldeman asked for an opportunity to put his request and his thoughts in writing. It was already being worked on, he said. Sure, make the presentation, Haig said, glad for another opportunity to stall. Goldwater drove back to the Senate with Scott and spent more than an hour on the phone with Arizona reporters. Content that resignation was set, he then escorted his daughter-in-law to a dinner at the Iranian embassy. Senator Scott returned to his office and gave his staff the president's schedule for the next 2 days, which Timmons had given him. Scott warned that it was not to leak to the press. Thursday, 5:30 p.m., President meets with the bipartisan congressional leadership. 6:30 p.m., President meets with his old congressional friends. 9 o'clock p.m., television address to the nation announcing resignation. Friday, noon, resignation effective and Ford sworn in. Small ceremony in Oval Office. Haig stayed in his office, trying to keep the story of the president's expected resignation under wraps. For one thing, the president could change his mind. For another, there must be no interregnum. The transition, when it came, had to be quick and smooth. But Nixon was still president, and he had to be in a strong enough position to handle a crisis. Haig had to sustain the appearance that the president was still active and in charge. There were lies that had to be told to staff, to friends, to the press. Bill Baruti had scheduled a meeting of 23 housing and construction leaders in the cabinet room for the following day. Haig didn't tell him the president couldn't make it. The tea leaf readers all over the White House were looking for clues. The secretarial group in the counsel's office heard that Steve Bull was at the Exchange, a local bar, drinking one scotch after the other. They took that as an indication that it was all over. Actually, Bull didn't know what was happening either. He was at another bar, the class reunion, arguing with a friend that resignation was ill-advised. Haig was confident that the lid was on tight. Rosemary Woods was circulating among staff members in the East Wing, saying that the president would not resign. It was common knowledge that more than one speech was in the works. At lunch that afternoon in the White House mess, Price had lied flatly to his chief assistant Gergen and to Ann Morgan. He was not working on a resignation speech. Gergen and Morgan were unconvinced. After lunch, Gergen went back to his office and began an eyes-only memo to Price. Overall, Ray, Gergen typed on his electric typewriter, I'm suggesting a brief, dignified, generous, almost upbeat speech. It's absolutely essential that he be neither vindictive nor mawkish. This could be one of his shining hours, and the way he departs will have a tremendous impact on the country's future. By the time Price read the memo, he already had a draft of a resignation speech. The president had to resign, but there was nothing upbeat about the moment to Price, and there never could be. Then Bernstein came around with his non-resignation speech, in which the president was contrite, admitted his complicity, and talked about the country's great people and their capacity for forgiveness. Nixon would never give it, Price said. He'll never say, I'm sorry. The press was searching frantically for information. Terry Ivey had confirmed to UPI correspondent Helen Thomas that Ed and Tricia Cox had arrived from New York. The story went over the wire, and Manolo Sanchez angrily called Ivey to complain, saying that nothing was to be given to the press. Ivey argued back to one of Julie's best friends on the staff, Patricia Matson, that it was foolish not to answer routine press inquiries. Refusing to answer only bred more rumors and heightened the tension. Remember who you work for, Matson shouted at Ivey. These people's hearts are breaking. How can you want to help the press? You've got to figure out your priorities. Ivey refused all press calls for the rest of the day. Commotion and the incessant search for the slightest detail were getting on the nerves of the press office staff. Finally, Ziegler couldn't handle it any longer. He summoned Warren. God damn it, Jerry, cool them off. There was no way. The confusion was shared by the group that Buchanan and Whitehead assembled at White's house around 5 p.m. Ford wouldn't let anyone contact the Secret Service to obtain more office space for the transition effort. The vice president had told the New York Times that neither he nor his staff had made any plans. Earlier that day, at a regular weekly prayer meeting with Rhodes and Laird, Ford had shunned any discussion of his possible succession. But he had quietly directed his top aide, Robert Hartman, to draft a speech, quote, just in case. Buchanan and Whitehead took the precaution of going to White's house in separate cars. Former Congressman Burns was already there. Griffin and Bryce Harlow arrived soon after. White's son, Roger, was assigned to monitor the television set and answer the phone. Peggy White cooked some steaks. As the group worked on an 11-item agenda prepared by Whitehead and Buchanan, a call came for Griffin. The senator stepped out of the living room and picked up the phone. It was Ed Cox. Cox said he wasn't at all sure the president was going to resign. David and he had just met with Nixon and had received no assurances. There were hints, but nothing firm. The president had talked about being out of office and going back to California. It seemed to Cox that he was thinking about it being impeached and convicted. That would take months. More alarming, Cox said his mother-in-law had told him Dick is not talking about resigning. Griffin tried to calm Cox down. He again sounded distraught and mixed up. Cox told him once more that the family was deeply worried about the president's mental condition, the lack of sleep, the pressure. As Griffin rejoined the group, he was confused. He told the others that apparently the president was not talking about resigning. Buchanan was overwhelmed. They were moving on something that might not happen. In a week or a year, this meeting might be a great personal embarrassment to them all, and most of all to the vice president. It could be made to look like a beer hall push. Griffin went over his conversation with Cox. The uncertainty was terrible. Could it be a hoax or a setup? Several asked. Buchanan comforted himself that the vice president would not proceed unless he was positive. Ford always played on the side of caution. Anyway, it was more sensible to deal with the logistics of transition than with the possibility that Nixon would not resign. The president could only delay his departure. He could no longer avoid it. "We can't sit here and speculate whether it will happen or not," Buchan finally said. "We have to assume it will and proceed." He had a copy of the agenda in his hand, and he read the first item, assumption of office, the swearing in. Griffin was concerned about the tone of the swearing in. It must be low-key before a small audience. To hold the ceremony in the Oval Office might seem presumptuous. It was not Ford's office until he took the oath. There was disagreement on whether Nixon should be invited or whether Ford should mention Nixon in his remarks afterward. Burns said it was essential to avoid the kind of ceremony that took place when Ford was nominated to replace Agnew, the tasteless strolling strings and the pomp suggesting an occasion of national pride. Griffin urged that Nixon's staff be cleared out of the White House as soon as possible. It was assumed that the staff and the cabinet would resign. Everyone agreed that full disengagement from the Nixon White House was essential, but it would not happen overnight. Ford would have to meet with the White House staff at once and solicit their help in the transition. "The number one priority is to get rid of Ziegler," Buchan said. OMB Director Ash and his deputy Malek had to go immediately, others suggested. They were Nixon symbols. Buchan recognized that everyone was expressing their particular frustrations. Griffin wanted Congress to play more of a role. We can't decide that now," Buchan said. Working his way down the list, he focused on smaller problems. Should Ford attend church the first Sunday of his administration? About 9 o'clock, as they sat down to dinner, Scranton arrived. They went on until midnight. When the meeting broke up, Buchan thanked White's wife. "You might lose your dining room table to the Smithsonian someday," he told her. And we'll stop this session right there. We're still on Wednesday, August 7th, 1974. And we will be when we begin the next session of The Final Days by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. Thanks for watching.